On April 18, 1980, Zimbabwe emerged from the ashes of colonial Rhodesia. Flags of liberation waved as jubilant crowds celebrated in Harare.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Zimbabwe and observe the laws of Zimbabwe. So help me God.
This occasion would mark the end of nearly a century of colonial and settler rule, a triumphant moment for a people who had fought long and hard for their freedom. Yet the journey to that historic day was one of immense struggle, defined by war, resistance, and unwavering determination. As independence swept through neighboring Zambia and Malawi in the 1960s and Mozambique and Angola in the 1970s, the fire of liberation ignited within Zimbabwe's majority. What followed was a bloody and dramatic chapter in history, the Rhodesian Bush War and the rise of liberation leaders like Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the story of the rise and fall of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe's liberation struggle. The name Zimbabwe originates from the Shona word Zimbadzamabwe, meaning house of stones. Approximately 27 kilometers from the city of Masvingo lie the massive stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe, which were identified as the one-time center of a vast pre-colonial African state. This site, along with several smaller but similar complexes scattered throughout the region, was created by the Shona people who had inhabited the area for over 8 centuries. In the 19th century, the Ndebele people, descendants of the Zulu, brought a new chapter to the region's history. In the late 19th century, European powers intensified their colonization of Africa during the Scramble of Africa, carving up the continent in pursuit of wealth and dominance. One of the central figures in this expansion was Cecil John Rhodes, a British imperialist whose ambitions were fueled by immense wealth from diamond mining. Cecil Rhodes established the British South Africa Company in 1889, securing a royal charter to exploit and govern territories in present-day Zambia and Zimbabwe. Now, Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company, the BSAC, ventured into the region driven by the promise of gold. Inspired by the wealth of South Africa's goldfields, Rhodes believed the region held vast mineral riches that could fund his dream of expanding the British Empire across Africa. When they came to Zimbabwe, Cecil Rhodes' BSAC used manipulation and force to assert control over the territory. A pivotal moment came in 1888 with the signing of the Rad Concession, a controversial agreement between BSAC representatives and King Lobengula of the Ndebele. The concession, obtained through deceit, granted the BSAC extensive mining rights. King Lobengula, realizing the implications, later repudiated the agreement, but the company used it as a pretext for its occupation. On September 12, 1890, a pioneer column consisting of 200 settlers and several hundred mercenaries raised the British flag at a site they named Fort Salisbury in Mashonaland. By 1895, Cecil Rhodes had solidified his hold on the region, which was formerly named Rhodesia, in his honor. Cecil Rhodes controlled the British South Africa Company until his death in 1902, but its early years were anything but stable. One of the most defining moments of this period was the Ndebele Shona Rising of 1896 to 1897, known as the First Chimurenga. The uprising erupted while many colonial forces were distracted, participating in the ill-fated Jameson Raid in the Transvaal Republic in present-day South Africa. In March 1896, the Ndebele people launched a rebellion against colonial rule, followed by the Shona in June of that year. Key settlements such as Bulawayo came under siege by Ndebele and Shona forces. However, the settlers' use of machine guns made direct assaults on fortified positions nearly impossible. The siege of Bulawayo was lifted in May 1896 when reinforcements arrived from as far away as Kimberley and Mafikeng in South Africa. Even with the siege broken, the fighting persisted. For instance, Shona leaders continued their struggle, engaging colonial forces in a drawn-out conflict. Unfortunately, one by one, these leaders were defeated. By 1898, the rebellion had been quelled, with many Shona leaders captured or exiled. Rhodesia was established not as an indirect rule colony like Nigeria or Egypt, but as a settler colony akin to Australia or Canada. This meant that the foundations of governance were built around land seizures, racial segregation, and policies designed to attract white settlers by offering them exclusive privileges. A rigid racial hierarchy was imposed, with citizenship and civil rights reserved for the white minority. Urban spaces, political power, and economic opportunities were effectively off-limits to the African majority. Through this system, the colonial authorities ensured that Africans were excluded from governance and kept away from the centers of power. While the search for gold was a primary motivator for the settlers, the region's fertile land soon became another focus. Following the wars of the 1890s, the Ndebele and Shona people were systematically dispossessed of their land and confined to reserves. By 1922, 64% of the African population had been forcibly relocated to these often arid, unproductive areas. Heavy taxes such as the infamous Hut tax were imposed to compel Africans to seek work in the colonial economy. Settlers, needing cheap labor for mines, farms, and factories, created laws that forced Africans into exploitative long-term contracts, binding them to labor compounds. These compounds were designed to limit their freedom and ensure a continuous and compliant workforce. In 1922, the settler population voted to become a self-governing colony under direct British rule rather than being incorporated into the Union of South Africa. This then led to the establishment of the colony of Southern Rhodesia in August 1923. As a British colony, Rhodesia strengthened its ties to the empire, actively participating in global conflicts such as the Second World War, further embedding its place within the imperial system while maintaining its oppressive structures at home. The British government retained control of external affairs and a final veto in respect to legislation directly affecting Africans. With self-governance secured, the white minority government quickly entrenched racial segregation policies that favored settlers at the expense of the African majority. Laws such as the Land Apportionment Act of 1930 divided land into European and African areas, reserving the most fertile land for white settlers and relegating Africans to native reserves. These tribal trust lands accounted for a large portion of the land, but were often located in arid, less fertile regions, making them unsuitable for sustainable agriculture. In 1934, the Industrial Conciliation Act was enacted to regulate industrial workers, trade unions, wages, and related matters. However, the law consistently discriminated against Africans despite undergoing numerous amendments over the years. Initially, under this law, only white laborers were classified as workers, while African laborers were subjected to the restrictive provisions of the Masters and Servants Act. In 1951, the Native Land Husbandry Act was enacted, abolishing African communal land ownership. Under this law, Africans were also subjected to restrictions on the number of cattle they were allowed to own. These policies severely restricted African economic opportunities and exacerbated inequalities. Meanwhile, the settler economy flourished under this system. Agriculture, particularly tobacco farming, became a cornerstone of Rhodesia's economy alongside mining of valuable resources like gold and asbestos. By 1953, Southern Rhodesia had a European population of 157,000 and an annual revenue of more than £28 million. At the forefront of shaping the colony's policies during this era was Godfrey Huggins, later known as Lord Malvern. Huggins served as a Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia for 2 decades and was one of the most influential architects of the colony's policies. Godfrey Huggins argued that Africans should not be entrusted with political power until they had gained sufficient experience to cooperate with Europeans in maintaining the economic growth of the colony. This paternalistic approach ensured that the African majority remained politically disenfranchised despite their contributions to the colony's economic foundations. Godfrey Huggins also championed the idea of closer integration between southern Rhodesia and its northern neighbors, northern Rhodesia, later Zambia, and Nyasaland, later Malawi. Although his attempts to amalgamate southern and northern Rhodesia failed, he threw his support behind the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, established in 1953 with British approval. The federation brought together the three territories ostensibly for mutual economic benefit. However, it was deeply unpopular among Africans who saw it as a means of further entrenching white dominance. Protests and resistance movements emerged, but the colonial authorities ignored them, pressing forward with their vision of a unified settler-dominated state. The tide began to turn in 1962 when the British government yielded to demands for independence in Zambia and Malawi. By 1964, these two nations had achieved full sovereignty, effectively dismantling the federation. The independence of Zambia and Malawi dealt a significant blow to colonial rule and heightened fears among southern Rhodesian settlers. Surrounded by this rising tide of African nationalism, they viewed the shift as an existential threat to their political and economic dominance. During this time, Britain's stance was clear. It would not grant independence to any territory that refused to embrace majority rule, a condition that southern Rhodesia's white minority rejected outright. In 1962, a new right-wing political force emerged in southern Rhodesia, the Rhodesian Front. Promising to deal harshly with African nationalism and secure white dominance permanently, the RF quickly united a range of conservative white factions into a formidable political organization. With strong backing from white farmers fearful of losing land and urban workers concerned about African competition, the RF swept to victory in the December 1962 elections. This set southern Rhodesia on a collision course with Britain and the broader decolonization movement. The RF has been generally described as a conservative party focused on protecting white Rhodesian interests and opposing majority rule. The party argued that granting majority rule would lead to economic collapse, a breakdown in law and order, as well as the rise of communism in Rhodesia. The party also encouraged white immigrants from other African colonies to settle in Rhodesia. They promoted what they called separate economic advancement, arguing that this approach would eventually lead to equality between black and white Rhodesians as an alternative to majority rule. While Rhodesia and the RF avoided South Africa's rigid apartheid system, its policies entrenched racial privilege and economic inequality.
This happens when in fact you find a white with lower qualifications getting a job that an African who could do it better, who has got a better intelligence, can't get.
By 1974, the average annual earnings of black workers stood at $641 compared to $7,150 for white workers. Similarly, government spending on education reflected stark disparities, with $68 allocated for each African child in school, while $750 was spent on each white child. By 1964, Ian Smith, a hardline politician from the Rhodesian Front, became Prime Minister. Just days after his 45th birthday, Ian Smith declared that Africans would not be ready for majority rule in his lifetime.
I don't believe in black majority rule ever in Rhodesia, not in 1,000 years. I think it will be a disaster for Rhodesia.
His infamous slogan, "No majority rule in my lifetime," became the RF's rallying cry, reassuring the white population of his resolve to defend their privileges. Ian Smith flatly rejected Britain's insistence that independence required African representation in governance, portraying this demand as a threat to white survival. In this regard, his government began preparing the population for a unilateral declaration of independence, the UDI, casting it as the only way to preserve civilized governance. On November 11, 1965, Ian Smith declared independence from Britain without Britain's approval in an effort to maintain white minority rule. Britain, unwilling to use military force, imposed economic measures, including asset seizures and a break in the currency link. The United Nations followed suit, instituting sanctions in 1966, the first in its history. These sanctions broadened in 1968 to include a near-total trade embargo aimed to pressure Rhodesia into abandoning white minority rule. However, Smith's government circumvented many restrictions with the covert support of South Africa and Portugal. In 1969, Ian Smith held a referendum among Rhodesia's white electorate, securing approval for a new constitution that cemented white political control and paved the way for a declaration of a republic on March 2, 1970. During the mid-20th century, Marxism swept through Africa, bringing with it ideals of anti-colonialism, racial equality, and economic justice. These revolutionary ideas called for the redistribution of wealth and power from colonial elites to the African majority, striking a deep chord with marginalized communities across the continent. Countries like Congo, Nigeria, and South Africa saw the rise of Marxist-inspired movements, and Rhodesia was no exception. Several nationalist groups emerged determined to end white minority rule and reclaim their land and sovereignty. Two of the most influential figures in this struggle were Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. Robert Mugabe was born in 1924 in Kutama and excelled academically. In 1949, Mugabe received a scholarship to the All-Black College at Fort Hare in South Africa, where he met other future African leaders such as Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda. As a young man, he strongly believed in the redistribution of land to dispossessed African farmers, warning that racial conflict was inevitable if African nationalism was ignored.
Everybody must be accorded his full political rights, whether he be white or black, educated or uneducated, rich or poor. And this is exactly why we are at the moment struggling to earn for our people one man, one vote.
Joshua Nkomo was born in 1917 in Matabeleland. Joshua Nkomo first headed the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress. In 1959, the Unlawful Organizations Act and the Preventive Detention Act were enacted in Southern Rhodesia. These laws were used to ban various African nationalist organizations, starting with Nkomo's ANC, and to arrest their leaders. When Nkomo's ANC was banned by the colonial government for its anti-colonial activism, Nkomo became the leader of the newly formed National Democratic Party, the NDP, in 1960. The NDP quickly gained mass support, advocating for black majority rule and challenging the entrenched system of white minority governance. However, the party's rising popularity and demands for independence led to its banning in December 1961. In response to the NDP's dissolution, Nkomo and his supporters founded the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU. Around the same time, Southern Rhodesia adopted a new constitution in 1961 that allowed a smaller number of Africans to enter parliament. Initially, Nkomo supported this constitution, seeing it as a step forward, but he later rejected it, realizing it failed to deliver substantive political change. His initial endorsement, however, cost him popularity among more militant nationalists who demanded immediate black majority rule. A more radical faction within ZAPU viewed Nkomo as too moderate. Robert Mugabe and others grew frustrated with what they perceived as Nkomo and ZAPU's cautious, centralized approach. This is why, in 1963, they broke away to form the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, adopting a more radical stance. Backed by China, ZANU emphasized guerrilla warfare and grassroots mobilization. Its armed wing, ZANLA, operated in rural areas, particularly among Shona-speaking communities, using Maoist tactics to disrupt Rhodesian infrastructure and supply lines. At the same time, Nkomo's ZAPU, through its military wing, ZIPRA, focused on conventional military strategies, including large-scale operations and cross-border raids from Zambia. ZIPRA's Soviet support allowed it to train a disciplined army and plan combined arms operations. However, its reliance on rigid structures and Soviet methods sometimes hindered flexibility and unity within its ranks. Meanwhile, Chinese training camps such as Itumbi in Tanzania shaped ZANLA's ideology and approach, teaching its fighters that the people are the key to victory. ZANLA's Darere Chimurenga created a dynamic and adaptive organization structure that integrated political and military efforts, while ZIPRA's reliance on Soviet advisors led to internal challenges, including splits like James Chikerema's formation of Rhodesia in 1971. But as the Liberation War escalated, ZANLA's grassroots approach and ZIPRA's military precision complemented each other in undermining the Rhodesian regime. At the same time, both ZANLA and ZIPRA faced severe repression under Rhodesian rule. For instance, Robert Mugabe was arrested in 1964 and detained for over a decade until 1974. Joshua Nkomo also faced repeated arrests in the early 1960s, with his longest stint in detention also lasting from 1964 to 1974. In 1965, as Rhodesia declared its unilateral declaration of independence, African nationalist groups began mobilizing both within the country and across its borders. What began as sporadic skirmishes escalated into a civil war between urban-based white settlers and rural African communities. Guerrilla forces including ZANLA and ZIPRA targeted isolated white farming communities in the bush, where dozens of lives were lost in ambushes. Newly independent Zambia became a crucial staging ground for ZIPRA, while ZANLA militants found similar support in Mozambique, particularly after its independence in 1975 under Samora Machel's Frelimo government. Both these groups relied on local youth, the Mujiba, who were the boys, and the Chimbwido, the girls, to serve as couriers and informants, ensuring vital connections to local populations. In order to counter this, the Rhodesian government implemented the Protected Villages policy in the mid-1970s, forcibly relocating rural Africans into guarded compounds. Officially designed to protect civilians, these villages aimed to isolate guerrilla forces from their support networks. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and food shortages in these compounds fueled resentments, further strengthening African resistance rather than weakening it. Efforts to resolve the conflict included the 1974 détente, led by Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda and South Africa's John Foster, which sought to reduce tensions and bring about a political solution. This détente resulted in the release of Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo from detention. While the détente provided temporary hope for a negotiated settlement, it failed to produce a lasting political solution. The release of the nationalist leaders from detention ultimately revitalized the liberation movements, leading to intensified guerrilla warfare and greater international pressure on the Rhodesian government. In 1975, the assassination of Herbert Chitepo, the chairman of ZANU's Darere Chimurenga, sent shockwaves through the liberation movement. The circumstances surrounding Chitepo's death, widely attributed to internal factionalism or external sabotage, plunged ZANU into turmoil, exposing deep divisions within the party. During this period of uncertainty, Dabaningi Sithole, ZANU's founding president, attempted to consolidate his position. However, his moderate stance and willingness to negotiate with Ian Smith's Rhodesian government alienated much of ZANU's military wing, which viewed Sithole as insufficiently committed to the armed struggle. By 1976, Robert Mugabe had effectively assumed control of ZANU, sidelining Sithole and reasserting the primacy of armed resistance as a path to liberation.
This is the voice of Zimbabwe.
Pamberi ne Chimurenga, Pamberi ne Hondo, Pamberi ne Ruzhinji rweZimbabwe.
People of Zimbabwe, victory is certain.
Seeking to unify the liberation effort, Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo forged the Patriotic Front, the PF, in 1976. Supported by majority-ruled neighbors such as Mozambique and Zambia, the Patriotic Front escalated the conflict, intensifying pressure on Ian Smith's government. Guerrilla attacks on white farming communities and loyalist black populations surged, forcing the Rhodesian regime to innovate its military strategies. The government established a comprehensive security structure, including the Rhodesian Army, which was widely regarded as one of the most formidable military forces in Africa. During the war, the Rhodesian forces developed cutting-edge tactics and tools to combat guerrilla warfare. This includes the V-shaped hull for mine-resistant vehicles, flechette rounds for jungle combat, and remote-controlled devices to neutralize bombs in urban areas. An important component of their counterinsurgency strategy was the Selous Scouts, an elite special forces unit composed of highly trained black and white commandos. The Selous Scouts excelled at infiltrating guerrilla networks and gathering intelligence, which informed larger military operations. They were trained in survival, tracking, reconnaissance, and guerrilla-style combat, making them one of the most effective counterinsurgency units in the war. By 1980, the Selous Scouts were responsible for neutralizing nearly 68% of guerrillas killed or captured within Rhodesia. Central to Rhodesian operations was the Fire Force strategy, a rapid reaction airborne assault designed to encircle and annihilate guerrilla units before they could escape. In Fire Force, helicopters and paratroopers were deployed in coordinated strikes supported by light aircraft delivering devastating firepower. This tactic created a ring of fire, trapping guerrillas and delivering lopsided casualty rates, with some engagements resulting in 80 rebel deaths for every Rhodesian soldier lost. One of Fire Force's most infamous operations was Operation Dingo in 1977, which targeted Zandla camps in Mozambique. Over 4 days, Rhodesian forces killed approximately 1,200 fighters and injured 5,000, suffering only minimal losses. Despite Rhodesia's innovative military strategies and technological superiority, the liberation movements gained strength driven by international backing and widespread support among Rhodesia's oppressed African majority. Guerrilla fighters from both Zandla and Zipra expanded their operations, bringing the war closer to urban areas while continuing to focus on psychological targets. White farmers abandoned vulnerable holdings, leading to vast tracts of untended land, while rural unemployment soared. Schools and clinics closed across the region, and more than 800,000 black civilians fled to overcrowded refugee camps. Curfews, systematic identity checks, and expanded powers under the Emergency Powers Act and the Law and Order Act led to a dramatic increase in prosecutions. For white Rhodesians, mandatory conscription and societal pressure made military service a rite of passage, portrayed as an essential defense of their way of life. Propaganda campaigns glorified Rhodesian soldiers as heroes, with posters showcasing elite commanders and women protecting their homes. Yet this narrative masked the growing strain. Waves of immigration weakened Rhodesia's human resources, and the once formidable military began relying on poorly trained conscripts as casualties mounted. By 1979, Rhodesia faced an existential crisis. Guerrilla forces intensified their incursions, targeting key infrastructure, including a devastating rocket attack on a fuel depot that wiped out a quarter of the nation's fuel supply. The conflict's toll was staggering. Estimates suggest nearly 20,000 deaths during the war, with guerrilla fighters making up the largest share. Security forces suffered more than 1,100 fatalities, while 500 white civilians were killed, including passengers on 2 Air Rhodesia flights shot down by Soviet-supplied missiles. Thousands of black civilians died in crossfire or guerrilla attacks, while Rhodesian airstrikes and raids in Mozambique and Zambia caused further casualties.
We started our liberation struggle in earnest in 1966. It has continued ever since. and there is absolutely nothing new. If there is escalation, this escalation is something that is to be expected in any liberation struggle.
But do you, in Geneva, have contact with the fighters in the field?
Yes, of course. We are the head of the army.
As the war expanded, the Rhodesian government's response, including harsher emergency measures, only deepened anti-government sentiment. Facing growing international isolation, economic collapse, and unrelenting guerrilla resistance, Ian Smith turned to moderate African leaders like Bishop Abel Muzorewa in a bid to negotiate a solution. This effort by Smith culminated in the Internal Settlement of 1978, which sought to create a biracial government while preserving white minority privileges. Abel Muzorewa became the first black prime minister of the transitional government of Zimbabwe Rhodesia in 1979, following elections held under the Internal Settlement. Without the involvement of the Patriotic Front, however, the settlement failed to garner international recognition or domestic support, leaving the conflict unresolved. In late 1979, after years of conflict and failed settlements, representatives from the Rhodesian government, African liberation movements, and Britain gathered in London for critical peace talks. The negotiations held at Lancaster House and chaired by British Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington brought together key figures in the conflict. These talks were marked by sharp disagreements, particularly over the contentious issue of land reform. For the liberation movements, redistributing land was a non-negotiable demand as white settlers controlled the most fertile areas while the African majority was confined to overcrowded barren reserves. Under mounting pressure from the international community and neighboring African nations like Zambia and Tanzania, a compromise was reached. Land reform was included in the agreement but postponed immediate redistribution. A willing buyer, willing seller framework was established, with Britain pledging financial support to facilitate future land transfers. While this provision temporarily safeguarded settler interests, it planted the seeds for future disputes over land ownership. The Lancaster House Agreement also outlined a ceasefire, the establishment of an interim British administration, and the holding of elections under universal suffrage. Under this agreement, liberation fighters were required to assemble in monitored camps within Zimbabwe, overseen by British forces as preparations for the elections began. While Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo expressed frustration with the limited scope of the provisions of the Lancaster House Agreement, they recognized the agreement as a pathway to independence and agreed to move forward. The long and arduous journey to freedom reached its pinnacle in March 1980 when Zimbabwe held its first democratic elections under universal suffrage. Robert Mugabe's ZANU secured a resounding victory, drawing overwhelming support from rural voters, particularly among the Shona-speaking population.
How do you feel about the result, the news of the result you just heard?
Well, I feel they are free and fair. They are very good and exciting. What you want now is unity. Since everything is over, I'm very glad bloodshed is now ended. And I hope everybody, part and parcel of this country, is going to follow the next government.
Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU, though a vital force in the liberation struggle, won fewer seats, largely in its Matabeleland stronghold. Meanwhile, Ian Smith's Republican Front, formerly the Rhodesian Front, retained a handful of parliamentary seats reserved for white people under the Lancaster House Agreement.
I feel sick. That's all I can say.
Are you going to stay in Rhodesia?
I don't think so.
No. Where will you go?
I go to Britain, in spite of the weather.
Robert Mugabe, in his first speech as Prime Minister-elect, struck a powerful tone of reconciliation. He reassured the white minority that there would be no retribution and invited political rivals, including Joshua Nkomo, to participate in building Zimbabwe's future. On April 18, 1980, Zimbabwe officially gained independence, bringing nearly a century of colonial and settler rule to an end. Robert Mugabe assumed the role of Prime Minister, with Kenan Banana serving as the ceremonial president. Joshua Nkomo joined the government as a senior minister, symbolizing a temporary truce between ZANU and ZAPU. Robert Mugabe's early leadership, emphasizing reconciliation and inclusion, raised hopes for a prosperous future. However, deep-rooted challenges cast a shadow over these aspirations. Unresolved land disputes and the uneasy alliance between ZANU and ZAPU hinted at the difficulties ahead. Don't be shy to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.